Yes, so the book is not a very big book, but it's a kind of a synthesis of 10 years of research. So basically, we believe that social change is has to be prefigurative. So you have to look at the seed forms of people that are trying to bring solutions to the systemic crisis of our society and our civilization. And so, by definition, those solutions cannot be of the same order and logic than the system that has created the solutions. And so we looked very carefully for a number of years at open source communities, how they were functioning, their licenses, their governance methods, and their collaboration methods. Then we looked at urban commons, so people who take into their own hands, to produce renewable electricity, renewable energy, or organic food, or shared habitat, shared mobility. And so basically, there's a kind of a common core, a common organizational logic to it, which is that the value is created in contributory communities. So people are collectively contributing to a commons, which can be open source software, open design, but can also be a cooperative dealing with energy, etc. So that's the kind of core of the system. Then you have, if you want to make a living from it, which most people will want to do because it's unsustainable, to have any systems to rely entirely on volunteering. So people try to create economies around it, and especially generative economic forms. So market forms that work for the commons and for the commoners. And then what we also see is that most of these projects will have associations that do not direct the work. So the Wikimedia Foundation doesn't tell anybody in Wikipedia what they should be writing, and the Linux Foundation doesn't tell any developer what they should be working on. But they maintain the infrastructure of cooperation. So, maintain the licenses, go to court when need be, create conferences, certification systems, and they kind of regulate the relationship between the community, the businesses, and eventually, the legal and societal infrastructures. And so, what I'm doing is blowing up this system to say this is how society could look like, and actually likely will look like, because this is a new logic in which civil society becomes productive. So every citizen creates value because he's engaged in the common good and the creation of actual commons. The market should serve civil society and its commons. And the state form, in the common good institutions that deal with everyone on a given territory, should basically have the goal to stimulate the autonomy of individuals and groups so that they can be autonomous in finding solutions. So this is what I call the partner state. So that's really the core of the book is, what are the relations between the open source communities, the entrepreneurial coalitions, and their for benefit associations, and what kind of society can we imagine if that would be kind of become the norm. Yes, actually, the blockchain is not very present in the book. You're completely right about that. But we actually have another publication, which is called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival, which deals exclusively with the commons. So the reason with the blockchains, and the reason is that this book reflects our pasts. It's a summary of our past, and this report is, like the kind of how we look at the future, and we look specifically at socio-technological infrastructures. And I'm not an unreserved blockchain fan, and if you like, I can explain why that is. So basically, what you find in the book is that there are 4 different types of structures that are being built today, and that have fundamentally different ideas about how the world should look like. So the first one, so imagine you have an X and a Y axis, centralized versus decentralized, for profit versus for benefit. So if you marry for profit with centralized, you get Google, Facebook, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb. In other words, P2P is at the periphery, at the front end, but everything inside is centralized. You don't own your data. Your attention is sold to advertisers. You have no autonomy. And so basically, if you look at philosophy, it's the world of Hobbes.
Yeah.
It's about surveillance and control and nudging and controlling. The other one is for profit but distributed, and that's the model that the blockchain represents. But there are a lot of how to say economic and political hypotheses that are behind the blockchain that I don't necessarily agree with. So, for example, if you look at blockchain systems, they almost exclusively use corporate competitive game theory, game theory, but in terms of incentives. So the belief is that we're all individuals, and that we basically are market players, and then we do smart contracts, and the machine algorithm will verify the smart contracts, right? There's very little in the blockchain about community, about society, about nature, about ecology. Um, so one of the things that I do in my report is say, okay, the blockchain is very interesting because it's ecosystemic. It's about ecosystems, aligning multi-stakeholders. It's open source. It's open and permissionless. So there's some really good things about it. And what it allows is to do something that we really need today, which is common accounting, ecosystemic common accounting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for example, one of the things I do is an exercise in this report is, okay, if you would think like about the blockchain, but as a commoner, we might think about it somewhat different. We would say, well, yes, people get motivated by gain, but not only by gain. There's many other things that people value. Mm-hmm. So why not have cooperative games, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we're individuals, but we also belong to groups. So why not have also Ostrom contracts? So in other words, like building in collective agreements. Most cryptocurrencies are commodity currencies, supply and demand. They don't give you information about the impact you're having on nature and on people. So we could have mutual credit currencies, and we could have asset-backed currencies, which give you information about the world directly. So this is how I think about the blockchain. So I think we need distributed ledgers. I'm not entirely sure that the form in which that it has taken is the best one.
Okay.
Now, this being said, historically, it's not always the best technology that wins out, right? So, for example, I'm more in favor of holochain, but holochain is very marginal at the moment compared to, let's say, Ethereum. Mm-hmm. And similarly, when you look at video formats, we had Betamax and VHS. VHS wasn't the best one, but they did porn. And so they became the standard. Yeah. And Betamax, which refused to do it, got disappeared. So blockchain might very well be the standard for the future. That remains to be seen. But I would like to tweak and transform it so that it recognizes social and environmental externalities, which is not really doing well for the moment. Mm-hmm. It's mostly blind to it. Right? So you look at your own ecosystem, but most blockchain projects don't really look at the outside. No, I think DAOs is a very interesting development. And, in complex societies where we want to automate some of the things that we do, I think a DAO makes a lot of sense. So my question is more like, what do people in the blockchain call governance? And very often it's only individual incentives. Mm-hmm. So they think of governance as coordinating a mass of individuals. I would like to see DAOs where the place of the human is recognized, so that we actually sometimes have to make collective decisions in the sense of we are a community, these are our values, we have a social charter, and in our community, this is how we want to do this. Not purely individual market players, but as a value community, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if Aragon does that, or Pando, but that's what I would like to see. So, because the danger, and I've seen this happening at some point, when you under-tierize governance, mm-hmm. then when there is a real conflict, there is no solution. and then you have to go back to authoritarianism. Think about the DAO theft.
Mhm.
When the so there was no way to discuss it. The only way to actually stop it was to one person saying, okay, we'll just bring back the clock to before the theft, and that will be right. So that's often missing in blockchain project, which is a thinking about, well, how do we make decisions together? So not just incentives for individuals, right?
Mhm.
But recognizing that there is a community and that there is a society. It's often not the case.
Mhm.
It's and then what you get is when it doesn't work technologically, then only people who can take authoritarian measures become then the dominant force because there's no mechanism for discussion.
Mm. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think if you look at the original sociology of blockchain, it's engineers, computer engineers, and then they discover economics, and the kind of economics they discover is, in the case of blockchain, Austrian economics. That's just one school of economics,
Mhm.
and so there's a lack of knowledge that there is actually a lot of pluralistic interpretations in economics that have very different point of view and results. And so I think that as blockchain gets bigger, this core gets more challenged, right? There will be more and more people taking the blockchain and saying, well, we like what the blockchain can do, but we don't necessarily agree with, the original ideas of the design, and they will try to tweak it. And so I keep a list on the P2P Foundation, and I don't know your project well enough to
Yeah.
judge it, but we keep a list of blockchain projects that we are interested in because they have these other values and also embedded, right?
Mhm.
So I think we need more pluralism in the blockchain community, and so the people can then also tweak some of the designs so that they can do different things and embed different values. Yes, so I'm not sure why Satoshi chose a P2P foundation, but he might have thought that peer-to-peer was this kind of technological principle, right? Where in fact what we say in the P2P Foundation is that by analogy of the technological peer-to-peer systems, we want social systems. So if you have a system of where all the computers are independent of each other, then the people using the computers can also start building social relationships based on that autonomy. So that's the idea, and I'm not sure that Satoshi fully understood, where he was going. um, but so my point of view of the Bitcoin from the very beginning was very similar to the blockchain, which is it's something we need. And so I consider Bitcoin the first socially sovereign currency that scales, right? Because we had local complementary currencies, they have a very limited territorial influence and usually very low turnovers, and they only work for certain things. So I think it was very interesting to have a proof that we can have scalable cryptocurrencies. My critique is the same as on the blockchain, is that the Bitcoin is designed in the same way. So my thesis is very simple. Any competitive system that deals with scarce resources tends to our oligarchy.
Okay.
It's an iron rule. So you take land in feudalism, you take capital in capitalism, you take knowledge in knowledge capitalism. The same thing tends to happen, and the reason is, so you're playing Monopoly. You all start with the same money and the same luck. But every round, somebody has been more lucky than you or more clever than you, right? So the second iteration, there's somebody stronger than you. And so what you get in the Monopoly game is at the end, you have one player who gets everything. And historically, that's what happened with any competitive system. It's not an accident. And so we already see that Bitcoin is more unequal, has a higher Gini coefficient than any sovereign currency.
Mhm.
So I have a mitigated and complex, feeling about Bitcoin. But I think historically it's absolutely important because as the first one, that then creates the possibility to create many, many other cryptocurrencies that can be programmed differently. So, I still think historically this is a real pivot for creating these translocal, transnational structures. So I think that we have a system of nation states, with territorial nations. And I don't think personally that they're going to disappear anytime soon. We're in a period now where they want to reinforce themselves. But at the same time, we have an increasing number of virtual nations, of people organizing, economies and value systems that directly operate translocally and transnationally, right? So the challenge for the future is how are these two going to work together or have conflicts or. But I think that, as a more progressive person, so now we have capital state nation, and the problem is that we cannot no longer change the system to the nation state because capital is transnational. So we have to create generative ethical alternatives that can operate translocally, transnationally, and build social power that can play at the same level as transnational capital.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my point of view. So I'm not an anarchist. So what I think is common to anarchism, both left and right, so the libertarian right and the collectivist anarchist on the left, is that they believe society is simply based on agreements between either individuals or groups. So left anarchists will tend to say, we want a society with autonomous communities who can make agreements with each other. And right-wing anarchists will say, we want a society where individuals can make agreements with each other, right? And I don't believe this is the case. I think we are always born in systems already. And so, in other words, there is a field. There's not just individuals and relations, there's a field in which we operate and which is, overdetermines our degree of freedom or unfreedom. And I also think it's unavoidable. As soon as we have a class society, already 5,000, it has been the case of 5,000 years. If you're optimistic, you would assume, well, the state is oppressive. Yes, that's true, of course, because it maintains an unequal structure. So you could say, well, of course it's oppressive because it maintains this unequal structure. But it's also the result of a compromise because people have struggled over many centuries, over who gets what. And so the state also represents that compromise. You have civic rights, you have redistribution systems that help the poor. So there's a lot of things the state does that if you don't have the state, it doesn't mean everybody would be equal. It could also mean that either the poor, mobilize to take away land from the rich, but the opposite is just as likely, which is that, paramilitaries funded by oligarchic landowners just say, oh, there's no state anymore. Now we can do what we want. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. I think it's unavoidable that we have mediating institutions in a class society. It's just absolutely unavoidable. So if it's unavoidable, we have to make it a good one.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is we have to move from for the market state paradigm to a common state, basically, right? To the common of the commons. Because every commons, let's say, or every virtual nation, if you like, with its, common infrastructure that it uses to do things, is only thinking about itself. You do Linux, you think about Linux. You do Arduino, you think about Arduino. So what kind of institution is going to take care of the whole? That's my question. And I think we need institutions to do that. I think we need common good institutions. As long as we live in territories, and I know, some panarchists, for example, they would say, well, let all have our own rules. Well, that's a very dangerous thing because you live somewhere and maybe you have people who believe that adulterers should be beheaded.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you marry a woman from that community. So, do you agree with that? So who's going to deal with those kinds of conflicts? So you will if you wouldn't have a state, you would need to invent it.
Yeah.
See what I mean? So it's
Mhm.
unavoidable, and so we have to transform the state so that it works for us, right? So we have capitalism because we had capitalists.
Yeah.
500 years of merchants and industrialists, shaping the world to their image. And if you want to move to another type of society, which for me is common centric society, we have to shape the state and the market to so that it works for us. No, I think it's very interesting what Pando and Aragon are trying to do, which is give kind of a design freedom for governance, right? So that you can, on top of Ethereum, create governance mechanisms that are freely chosen and collectively decided. Whether the maintainer system is bad in itself, I'm not sure. So here's my vision on this. So in traditional modern industrial systems, they were based on permission. So you can only work if you get a job, and then you're subordinate to a hierarchy. And so what we've done in the last 15, 20 years through the networks is we created open, contributive, permissionless systems, right? But it didn't eliminate hierarchy. The hierarchy moved from a command and control function to a control function. But that control function is very necessary. So, in other words, what the maintainers do is not tell you what to do, but they can say no and
Mhm.
um, they can defend the integrity of the ecosystem. Personally, I think in open source software, it has worked pretty well. However, for me, a case study of how not to do it would be Wikipedia. When Wikipedia shifted from a vision of abundance, where everybody could write on any subject, to a vision of what they call notoriety. So it had to be a real encyclopedia with only important articles. They created artificial scarcity,
Mhm.
and then the maintainers got the power to basically tell you, oh, but you don't count. And so writing for the Wikipedia has become a very political thing, because if you want something divergent, you have to mobilize support to be able to withstand the pressure of the editors. So I think the function is vital. The function of protecting the integrity of an ecosystem. You cannot have commons without defending them. This is what Ostrom has also learned,
Mhm.
studying all the previous commons. But I agree with you that maybe there are other ways to maintain the integrity of the system that don't place it into individuals, but in a more collective sense. So I think it's certainly worth experimenting, but we have to be careful, because purely horizontal systems are also problematic. So you have vertical and horizontalism, and I think we have to find a kind of the golden hybrid
Mhm.
mix, which can be contextualized to because what works in one system, let's say going to space, where people can die if you make a software mistake,
Mhm.
is different from the Wikipedia, where nobody will necessarily die if you have the
Mhm.
wrong information. So the governance has to be aligned to the social object of the corporation. So I mean, this is absolutely crucial to my work as well. Is to find the right relationship between the market forms and the common forms. And so, how can we make capital regenerative and generative towards the commons and natural resources? So I think this linkage is crucial. Um, Now, the best way to do this, I'm not sure, and I think we will have a lot of experimentation, and then people have different value systems. So, but I like, for example, something like the idea of the Fair Shares Association, where they have four kinds of shares. The founders. Why? Because they may have worked 3, 4 years for free to make the project happen, and so they get 12% with demirage, which means that every 2 years 0.5% less. So they get a reward for their work, but not in eternity, right?
Mm.
The funders, the workers, and the users, right? So they have four types of shares, and they co-manage those entities. Another way is what Inspiral did to invest in Lumio, which is they created a wall between the mission-oriented entity and the capital. So the capital gets a return but didn't get power. So in your system, I think the thing to be careful about is not to give everything to capital, right? So what I think you should have is kind of a contributory value system, where you say it's definitely the financing is a contribution, but also the work and other network reinforcing activities, and they should all have a place and some power in the system, not just the people who bring money.
Mm.
There's a new book by James Scott,
Yeah.
which is about the emergence of the state in the grain-growing region of Mesopotamia, which is also a lot of friends tell me this is a really good book to understand the emergence of the state. And he mentions the same dynamic of barbarians versus the state. And just an example, but the reason that the Germanic tribes won against Rome is that they freed the slaves. So when they arrived in front of a Roman city, they would tell the slaves, if you leave the city or fight or join us, you'll be free. So this barbarian empire dynamic is really interesting.
Okay.
But I think the problem today is, we're so embedded in these complex state systems. It's very hard to be a barbarian. There's no place to be a barbarian. Maybe we can create virtual places, but